So, big disclaimer here, I am a developer, and because of that, there's going to be a little bit more development in here than you probably care about, and that's just something that you are going to have to deal with. You're also not going to get pretty slides, because again, I'm a developer. I just don't care about that. That's a lie, it's just easier for me not to care. So, before I get into everything, I'm going to throw the developers under the bus a little bit so that I can later on throw the designers under the bus. That's the kind of talk this is going to be. So I need to review first what's called the Developer Code of Ethics that I may or may not have made up. But when working with a designer, this is everything that a developer has to agree to whenever we work with a designer, and it's very important that we do this. So there's four principles. First one is, even if we don't have to or even want to, we always have to deviate from the original design. If you tell us to build something and you give us a nice pretty picture, it is just, we cannot make it that same thing. We have to deviate from it a little bit, even if we don't want to. We just have to. That's our role as a developer in a project. 2, at least once say, we can't do that to the designer, or even better, just a flat out, I'm not going to do that. You know, nothing makes me happier than just having the designer show me something and saying, it's gonna do this, we promise it to the client, and I say, nope, not gonna happen. 3, we always have to get the project 90% close to the original design, and after that, we just say everything takes too much time, even if it doesn't. Like, even if it's so easy, we won't do it. It's just, again, it's part of our code. It's not that we want to do this, we have to behave this way. And the last principle, never admit that we don't know something. Just say it's impossible if we just don't know it, even if there's plenty of websites that already do it. You know, like the Twitter application on the mobile phone, the splash screen has a fun animation. If anyone asks me how to do it, it's impossible. It's not a real thing. You can't do it. So that concludes the Developer Code of Ethics when working with the designer. A little tongue-in-cheek, I know, but again, now I get to just lay the onslaught on the designers here. So get ready. We're gonna have some fun with that. So now let's get to the actual topic at hand. What is accessibility? So accessibility is kind of known by not even an acronym, just an abbreviation. You might have seen this before. You can say that word as ALLY, just A11Y. People are lazy, so instead of writing out accessibility, we just say A, 11 characters in between, and Y. So if you ever see this, that means accessibility. And this is a thing that is used. So what is accessibility? And this is going to be a definition that I kind of made up, but I think it's probably the most accurate definition, and it's just giving a frick about people, like everybody, all people. That includes people with disabilities, and that includes people with no disabilities at all. Literally everyone. And I think that's an important concept, and kind of as we go through a lot of the stuff, we got a lot to cover, you're gonna see that, you know, we are catering towards users with disabilities to some extent, but again, the general idea is making a better website in general. So think about it this way. We think of ramps as entering a building as kind of an accessible thing, but I would argue that stairs are accessible as well. You know, if you've ever tried to enter a 2-story building, like a door on the 2nd floor without stairs or a ladder even, like, we have not gotten to the point where we can jump 20 feet in the air. So that's accessibility there. So the main concept that I'm going to make is that building an accessible website is going to make your website better overall, not just for a certain niche category of people, as that's probably what you might be thinking of. And how do we do this? How do we make the website better overall? Well, that ends up by building something accessibly. You have better design architecture. What I mean by this is that you can actually build standards that will stay the test of time. You know, accessible standards are largely the same as they were 10 years before. They've changed, everything changes, but the things that were important as far as accessibility 10 years ago, even 20 years ago, are still important today compared to, I was talking with one of our designers, I think maybe a couple months ago, and I noticed he had a bunch of gradients in all of his designs, and I thought, what gives? I thought gradients were out like 5 years ago, and he says they are, but they're coming back. Like, we don't have to worry about that with accessibility. So you have a better design architecture, you have better code architecture, and that's because you can actually code things that work with what's called the accessibility tree in your browser. We're going to get to that. Being accessible means you have to have more quality content, and this is where we're stepping out of a niche user zone. We're not catering to any users here. Just being accessible means having good content. Having good content means better search engine optimization. Better search engine optimization means more people are going to use your site, and all that means you're going to make more money. So we want to make that money. So accessibility leads to money. Write that down. Developing an accessible website, depending on your project, it may also be required. And this is probably something that a lot of you may have heard about, and it's this Section 508. So I've got references to all of the links at the end, so don't worry about writing any of this down. But Section 508 is a portion of the Rehabilitation Act that was added over 20 years ago in 1998 that basically says that any federal technology or communication unit, that's a pretty broad category, I know, but it has to be accessible by all users, even users not of the federal government. So if you've ever worked on a government project, you know that accessibility has to be a concern. You have to build for that. And while Section 508 only at this point applies to federal government agencies, I think it's something that, the tenets of this you can apply to any project. Once you do it once, it's one of those things, it's just so much easier to build accessibly once you kind of have the fundamentals, and that's what we're going to go through today. We're just going to go through a lot of fundamentals. So some housekeeping. I try not to get on my 2019 millennial high horse very often, but saying users with disabled users, saying disabled users is bad. Users are more than their disabilities. You don't want to mesh those two together in a negative way like this. Instead, what you should say is users with disabilities. So if you accidentally catch me saying the opposite, then feel free to throw a wrap at me or some food, because that would be bad. But users with disabilities is the proper way to refer to this community. All right, time to bust some myths, and then we can get into the actual concerns. So myth number 1, accessibility means handling blind users, and that's it. And that's not the case at all. It means handling everyone. We've kind of already established this. Accessibility means everyone, no matter with disability or without, everybody. Myth number 2, accessibility means that I have to worry about screen readers and I have to put alt text on my images. That's kind of the meme, I think, when I talk about accessibility, is someone says, oh, just put alt text on your images. And if you're not familiar with what that means, we're going to get to that. But no, that's wrong. It's a lot of stuff. I keep alluding to this, a lot of stuff. And it's okay, though. We're going to do this together. A Success Kid is back to tell us that we can do this. So we're going to hold each other's hands, and we're going to get through this together. All right, we're going to get to the actual types of disabilities that we're going to be talking about that we want to handle. So I kind of break them out into 4 categories, and this is kind of a standard set. I didn't just make this up. You've got visual concerns, auditory concerns, motor concerns, largely focusing around hand usage, and cognitive concerns. I'm very excited to talk about the cognitive concerns because I think that applies to the most amount of users, because a lot of cognitive concerns are temporary concerns. We're going to get to all that. So we're going to start off with visual. That is the big one. Ooh, we got a bonus disability too we're going to talk about at the end. Visual concerns. This is going to be the big one. We got a lot of things to cover here, and screen readers, for example, we're going to take some time on that. Yeah, all right. Let's do it. So we're going to talk about screen readers, colorblind users, contrast, Z-scan, and we're going to talk about something called Open Graph. Let's talk about screen readers first. So if you ever want to mess around with a screen reader or use a screen reader, Chrome has a good one called ChromeVox. It's just a built-in plugin you can get for free. I recommend this to any developers trying to use things, as well as any designers who want to just experience what it's like to have a screen reader. Now, I have this installed right now, but it's disabled. I'm going to turn on, make sure that my audio is coming out of here. It's going to come out of my speakers here, so if you're on Twitch, you probably won't hear this audio, but that's okay. It's just default screen reader thing. So let's enable this extension.
ChromeVox spoken feedback.
Okay, there we go. So we're going to turn this off in a little bit, but I want to just walk through what a screen reader does. Okay. You click on anything, it's going to tell you what that is. You can tab on things. It'll tell you if it's a. It tells you if it's a link.
Extensions link. Chrome.google.category developer.
The orange background, the orange outline, that's from ChromeVox. Is adding that. And anyway, just anything you kind of go to, I'll keep toggling audio on that. Anything you go to, if you have any concerns with visual impairments, this is where you would want to use a screen reader. Images, for example, you can't really use a screen reader, so what happens then is it uses what's called alt text. We're going to get to that in a minute, but that's basically a text representation of what that image should be. So let's just see what alt text this image has right here.
Home extensions, ChromeVox offered by
Okay.
Chrome.google.com.
So that's
Average rating 2.6 out of 5. 857.
So what you're hearing there is the actual alt text that's going to be set on this image. This is very important because users with visual impairments have very difficulty seeing images. So, but screen readers can read the text behind that image. That becomes important. So I'm going to turn off the screen reader because it's going to just be loud. But Chromevox is the one that I use for development purposes. It's very easy to use. I literally enable it, and it just starts working. You can configure it. Let me turn that off and disable this. So, yes?
So is there an option for people that are low vision so that they sort of like drag their mouse over?
Yes, the question is, what about for users with a low vision impairment? Can they kind of drag around? They can, yes. You can toggle Chromevox to work on a focus, or not on a focus, on a hover state. So as you just kind of drag around your mouse, the screen reader will enable that. I've not dug a giant amount into the functionalities of Chromevox, but I know for a fact that that feature is there. So good question. So that's Chromevox. Now we're still talking about screen readers here because there's a lot of things that you can build that will make screen readers behave even better. They can work really well. So behind the scenes, a screen reader builds what's called the accessibility tree, and it looks kind of like this as an example. It takes some HTML element and it just builds a tree-like structure out of it. And your browser actually already does this behind the scenes. It's called the DOM tree. It stands for Document Object Model. The accessibility tree is a copy of the DOM tree, but it just adds additional features, which as a developer, we can code things in to make that work even better, which is what we're going to talk about here. What things can you add? Well, how can we maximize screen reader usage? You can use what's called semantic HTML, and we're getting into a little bit of development concepts here, but again, remember this and tell your developers to do it. That's what I'm going to say. Section, article, aside, nav. These are all just block-like elements on an HTML page. We may have heard of a div before. These are the same thing fundamentally, but they're just semantically different. If I have a nav, you can assume that's going to be a navigation. An aside, for example, is ideally like a sidebar type thing. An article is a section. I think they're pretty self-explanatory, section and article. And there's more to it than this. Now, another thing you can do is use image alt tags. And as I'm going through these, I've written a handful of blog posts on accessibility that kind of review some of this stuff. I've got these links at the end. But so I've got a section about semantic HTML elements. And let me zoom in on that a little bit. Image alt text is this thing right here. I've got an image tag. This would link to the reference of the image. The alt text, this is apparently a cool image of a penguin just chilling. It is not, but if there was a penguin just hanging out in this picture, that would be a good alt text image I could have. You don't need to describe in detail every single thing, but you get the point across. Saying things like logo or image is a no-no. Don't do that. Be a little bit more descriptive. Yes, don't let your marketer stuff it full of keywords. Also, title tags for non-image icons. This is an important thing because there are icons, for example, at the bottom here. I've got some space there. This is a GitHub URL. This is a Twitter URL. It doesn't say that anywhere, but I've set the title attribute on these so that if you actually hover over it, you can see Twitter at the bottom. But when a screen reader, because I've done that, that's not the main reason that you're supposed to do this. It's when a screen reader hovers over that, it can say, hey, this has a title called Twitter, and it will alert the user of that. Now, the link also, it's going to say the link to twitter.com, et cetera. Twitter's a pretty easy one to say, but if you've got a very obscure link, you can't just rely on that. Ideally, you have a title attribute. And this really only applies to icons like this. Again, if you have a link in text as anything, then it's going to, the content itself should direct what the screen reader is going to say. All right, one of the last things we're going to talk about are called ARIA properties. For my developers out there, I'm sure you've heard of these before. ARIA stands for Accessible Rich Internet Applications. And it looks like, I've got a separate blog post about this. It looks kind of like this. So I'm just going to go to one example on this. Let's say we've got a navigation. Like let's just say we've got this nav bar up at the top here. We've got some semantic HTML here, specifically with that nav, which is good. But we've got these other properties we've got a role property. Roles are everywhere. This is a navigation. We can see this is a menu bar here, which can refer to this being an actual bar, a menu bar. These are listed as menu items. None of this is required by HTML, but the accessibility tree will use these properties to maximize screen reader efficiency, just so it can do its own optimizations on the back end. Other things here, we've got ARIA has pop-up that alerts to the accessibility tree that we've got a submenu here that pops up. And we've also got ARIA hidden here, which indicates that this submenu is currently hidden. The idea being that if we were to hover over it and it shows, we would use JavaScript to toggle this and say that this is in fact false now. ARIA hidden is false. So this is kind of just an intro idea into ARIA roles. There's tons of them out there. There's not an overwhelming amount, but it's something that you might have a developer spend a half day digging into and kind of revamping a current website to use ARIA roles. That's probably more of a day-long project, actually. Yes, that's correct. The question was, these aren't CSS classes, and that's absolutely true. These don't affect the UI that you can visually see whatsoever. These are strictly to tell the accessibility tree what the purpose of these things are. And by default, if you write your HTML correctly, your accessibility tree will probably work as expected. But if you can give it little hints as to everything, that's even better. And honestly, like going through HTML that looks like this, even if you're not worried about accessibility, it's just much more semantically clear as to what you're looking at versus something else. So as a developer, I would love to go through this because it's just very indicative of what's actually happening here. So I love including this in HTML. And yeah, it's all used by the accessibility tree on the back end. So again, I've got a whole blog post over how ARIA roles work. Links to that at the end. But that's all we're going to talk about here with this. So how can you help a developer? You can tell them what the image's alt text should be. Don't let the marketers stick it with a bunch of stuff. Have it good quality content. That's the big thing. Quality content is king. And ensure the developer knows how everything interacts. If you know that a menu is supposed to pop open when you hover, make sure that the developer knows that. If you know there's going to be a card spinning action somewhere, make sure the developer knows that, and then they can account for it. At the very least, it's not your responsibility anymore. It's their responsibility because you've told them what to do. Okay, users with colorblind impairments. We're stepping out of screen readers now and just going to just general concerns. So there's another Chrome extension I'm going to plug here that's called No Coffee, and I'm not quite sure why it's called that, but I've got it installed right now, and it's a vision simulator here. So we can actually simulate various impairments. I'm going to focus mostly on the color deficiency, but for example, if you've got users who, let's say they have blurry vision, we can toggle that, and bam, we've got blur here. We can toggle, low contrast vision here. So you can see that's a problem right there for users who would have an impairment with contrast. You can even simulate just computer glare. So I've got a glare with the window behind me. Now again, we're talking about color blindness here. There's this color deficiency, and that may be hard to see right there. Let me see if I zoom into that. That helps a little bit. So we've got this color deficiency toggle here, and we've got a handful of things here. Color blindness is a separate topic on its own, but suffice it to say these first 4 items here focus on red-green color blindness, which is the most common. That is actually a sex-linked chromosome type thing, so mostly males will be affected by that. Interestingly, these 2 though are blue-green color blindness, and they're the same thing. Just one's halfway color blindness, the other one is full blue-green color blindness. That is not sex-linked, so both men and women have these same amounts. It's just not as common. And then you have lack of color perception period here. So let me zoom out and we can kind of see what this page would look like without that. So let's say we've got, so protanopia is red-green color blindness with an emphasis on the red side of it. So if I click on that, not a ton changed here, and this is the complete absence of being able to pertain that color. So you can see this is okay, but you can see everything has kind of melded more to a yellowish tint here. Let's see what happens if we say we've got blue-green color blindness here, tritanopia. We just can't perceive those colors at all. Again, this is actually usually ends up being better for perception, but you can still tell there's issues here. And again, if we just say all color is removed, period, we just don't see color here. So I like using this plugin. Every plugin I'm plugging here is free, by the way. It's nice to be able to kind of see how various colors interact on a web page. It's important to have different colors. That's why the idea of like a dichromat, a color scheme, and various other color schemes are important. That's why you don't have websites ideally that are just light red, and lighter red. So that's I'm going to turn that off for now. So that's color blindness. Handling users with a color blindness impairment is important, and this is one way you can test for that. Contrast is a big thing. I love it when my designers put a nice white background and use a light gray text. That's just lovely. It honestly does usually look pretty good, but it is just terrible for contrast. And this is obviously an extreme example, but there is a way to check for if your foreground and background color are contrasting enough, and there's a website here. So for example, let's look at this. We've got a nice white background, and we've got a nice dark blue foreground here, and we pass all the various tests here. As I start shrinking this, you can see tests starting to fail here. And even though you might argue that this is pretty still contrasting, it fails all the tests. So you might, I'm not sure how subjective these tests are. I believe they're fully standardized here. But I will say that there's been many websites I've worked on where the contrast seems fine to me, but it fails tests like this. So this is something to always check for. So contrast is a big concern. So now we're going to step now into areas which are less about users with disabilities and more about just something that is how humans behave on a website. It's called the Z-scan here. Whenever users are viewing a web page, we don't read the web page, we scan it. And what I mean by that is, this, and you might realize this yourself, when you're looking at a web page, this is the default way that people look at a web page. You have what's called the Z-scan. You look at the top bar, you diagonal cross over here to the bottom, and you go over to the right. That's why it's kind of fundamentally important to not have the whole image be the entire fold, if you will, the entire first view of a page. You want to have some content at the bottom because this is going to get much more read than your side content over here, etc. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to build your whole web page in a Z-like structure, but maybe multiple Zs is kind of the idea here. Have your content organized in a way that's going to maximize how humans, perhaps either efficiently or inefficiently, whatever you think, view a web page. So that's the Z-scan. I've got a link to a blog post. I did not write that one. Later on in the references that kind of talks about this a little bit more. All right, the last thing we're talking about with visual concerns, and this is also has nothing to do with any disabilities, is called Open Graph. So you might, I do have a blog post about this one. I used to be a pretty big blogger, if you can't tell. So you might have noticed, if you've ever been to Facebook, you might have seen something like this, where when you paste a link, it pulls in an image, it pulls in text, it pulls in a header, all that kind of stuff. Also on Twitter, it does that as well. Well, your website has to be set up for that, and it's very easy to do that. And you just add some HTML meta tags, and the meta tags, by default, are called these Open Graph tags. And this is literally all it is. And it's pretty human readable, I mean, besides the HTML mumbo jumbo. But you can see we've got a title here. The title of this movie is The Rock. It's a movie, the URL right here, the image, that's going to be the actual URL of the image that gets pulled in, and the description that's going to get pulled in. So things like Slack will pull this in. Open Graph is something created by Facebook a long time ago, but it's kind of become the standard. It is now separate from Facebook. It's a standard way to have internet-based applications pull in data kind of for preview purposes. So again, we're not talking about users with disabilities here, but that is an accessible concern if I can get a preview of something before I'm actually going to that link. Yes, question? Mm-hmm. Yeah, so how is this different from rich text? So by default, you're only providing the content here. You're not providing any formatting. It is up to the application itself. So this is on Facebook, for example. It's up to Facebook to organize this somehow. So it's saying, I'm pulling this image in. I'm going to show it like this. I'm going to show this font here. And it's up to Twitter to show it like this. That's why you can see they're a little bit different. So with rich text, you have usually more control over how you want your text formatted, especially if you're using a rich text editor, for example. So very good question. So that's going to mostly conclude the visual concern of this part. That's the biggest one. Auditory is going to be just a snap here. We'll go through that pretty quickly. And then we've got motor and cognitive concerns after that, plus a bonus. So auditory concerns. I know we're bulldozing through this. I know it's hard. One of my recommendations at the end is going to be, we're streaming this right now. It's going to be to watch this thing, because we're covering a lot of stuff. So auditory concerns. Well, when you have audio on a website or mobile app, you usually have it for two reasons. The biggest reason is just for media in general. Like you're showing a video, you're showing an audio file. That's all I can think of right now. But some sort of medium. But when you have audio for media purposes, it's imperative that you have subtitles. That might be a given. Users with audio impairments may not be able to hear much or may not be able to hear at all. So you need to have some sort of subtitles. You need to have volume controls to be able to toggle what the volume is. And ideally default to a muted state whenever you load whatever the content is. And that's not out of a convenience issue. You know, it's annoying when you scroll on a web page and audio starts blasting out at you. That's annoying, but that's not the main problem here. The main problem here is that a lot of users with auditory disabilities have issues where they can't hear very well, but you've also got the opposite spectrum of that, where you have users with hypersensitivity to audio. So and that can be something that's just like a true disability, or it could be something, maybe your hearing aid is toggled incorrectly, maybe you slept on it wrong, and some setting got set inappropriately, and you're waking up in the morning, scrolling down a website, still in bed, and you're scrolling and you see a website blaring at you. Well, that's not only annoying, but if you are hypersensitive at that moment, that can be an actual problem to you. So don't just blare audio at just randomly on a web page. Don't have that be the default. So this is how you handle audio concerns for media purposes. The other way you would have audio on a website would be for supplemental audio. This would be, go back to your AOL Instant Messenger days, whenever you're chatting with your friend on a Friday night, and you get that nice 3-tone ding whenever you send a message. That's supplemental audio. It's not super imperative to what you're doing. You don't need to hear it, but it is an extra thing there. So for supplemental audio, Slack does it too. Any real instant messaging chat application will do it. When you get a text message, for example, that's theoretically supplemental audio. To handle this, you need to have a visual cue of some sort, and that can be dependent on how imperative your audio is. If you're getting a message from someone, like let's say you're on Facebook Messenger, that's pretty important. You want to have some sort of a visual indicator. So a badge can be that indicator. You can have a notification bell toggling, like animating in the foreground, kind of in the corner. That's more up to you to decide. But again, based on how imperative the audio is, have a visual cue. And make sure that the audio itself is nothing absurd. If it's supplemental, it doesn't need to be loud, it doesn't need to be lengthy, and it definitely doesn't need to be confusing. One of my buddies showed me that in Slack now, you can have an audio cue that is a person saying hummus whenever someone chats you something. I would argue that's probably borderline. I get it, it's funny and everything, but at least if it was someone saying hummus 3 times, that's going to be a confusing, annoying thing. I can let that one slide. And anyway, and if you haven't heard of that, then try it out. It's a kick. And that concludes auditory concerns. I told you that one was going to be quick. Motor concerns, this is going to be another big one, not as big as visual concerns, but we've got some fun demos here. And I think this one is a bigger area that a lot of people don't think about. So with motor concerns, we're talking about users who usually can't use a mouse or can't use a mouse very well. They're usually limited to the keyboard, and at that point, and I'm talking about for navigational purposes too. So without having a mouse, you really have to think about development or layout of a web page in a different way. And it's not that you have to build your web page differently, you just have to handle different workflows. People aren't just going to be pointing and clicking for everything. You've got to think about what are called tab flows and using the tab button to kind of go through a web page. So we're going to get to all that. So we're going to talk about responsive applications, skip menus, tab flow, that's kind of what I just alluded to, focus indicators, submit actions, and cancel actions. This probably just sounds like a bunch of mumbo jumbo right now, but we're going to get to all this. Responsive applications are things that you probably have heard about. And you've probably seen this fancy graphic like a million times by now. But it is very important, and it's not, again, not just for convenience sake. It's annoying for me to have to go on my mobile phone and do the pinch zoom to see everything. It's much easier if I can just scroll on a vertical axis. But for users that have difficulty with a pinch zoom, then you're getting to another level of no-nos. Like that's a problem. A thumb scroll is one thing, but to have the motor capabilities of zooming, with 2 fingers, that's a significantly higher cognitive action there, or physical action. So think of that when you're doing responsive design, it's not just to make people happy. It is to make people happy, but it's to make people also just more physically comfortable as well. So responsive applications is one way to handle motor accessibility. Skip menu, this is one that I'm sure some people here have heard about, but I had not heard about this until I really got into accessibility, and a demo is worth 1,000 words. So let me go just to my website on the homepage. If I start tabbing, it's going to go to this nav bar at the bottom here, and you're going to be able to kind of see right there. You can see where we're kind of focused at. We're going to go to About, we're going to toggle the icons there, and I'm just hitting Tab to go through, and now we're going to get to the main content, which starts with these links right here. Well, my navigation was pretty short, but a lot of websites, especially government-based websites, are going to have very lengthy navigations, and if I have to tab through all of that to get on every single page to get to the main content, that's a pain, especially if I can't use my mouse and I'm subject to that. Well, there's this thing here called a skip menu, which you can see I'm toggled on right now. If I toggle off of that menu, and it's this thing right here, that only appears if I'm focused on that actual element, and I can't click on it. It's not visible. There's no way I can use my mouse to toggle that. It's just, I'm right here, I'm on the URL bar right here. If I hit Tab, that's going to toggle to my web page to get the first focusable action. Well, this is a hidden menu that can only be triggered by focus, so you only see it when I'm using Tab to focus on that. And if I hit Enter on this, it's going to bypass the whole menu bar down here, and it's going to set what's called my tab index to the first bit of actual, wherever I tell it to, but ideally it's the first bit of actual content, which from my website is this GitHub link here. So if I hit tab now, then bam, I'm automatically going to tab onto that. I can still do a shift tab to go back to the menu, but it just shoots me, it basically skips me past the menu, hence the name skip menu. And while this may just seem like some crazy witch magic, I know, it's very easy to do. Tell your developers that, it's very easy to do. It's just a little bit of HTML here, and this is just a sample menu. Like this is all I'm doing here that's important is I'm adding some sort of identifier on the wrapping thing and some sort of class here. And I've just got some CSS here to do. And we're not going to go through this, but it's just very easy. And again, links to this at the end. So skip menus are very important for users with motor disabilities. We're going to talk about tab flow next. So I kind of alluded to that a second ago, and I also was doing it here. If I'm tabbing through a website, it's very important that the flow of tab things is pretty, not only is it clear what I'm doing, but that it makes sense. Like I don't, if I were going to be, let's say I'm focused on that green link at the left right there. If all of a sudden I hit tab and it were to jump me up to this about link, that's not intuitive. That's not what your expected behavior would be. HTML in your browser by default handles this for you. Your tab flow will handle, it'll automatically tab to the next toggleable element, which is a link, a button, those kinds of things. You won't focus on text or an image because they're just non-interactive. But your browser will do this for you automatically, which is nice. But again, as developers, we have the power to mess everything up. We have the power to mess that up, which is bad. If we start putting things out of order and we use CSS to position them oddly, then that becomes a problem. So your tab flow is something you always want to check. And it's also a problem if I'm tabbing on a website and all of a sudden I tab and I don't know where I am and I keep hitting tab and I have no idea where I am and then I finally end up at the bottom of the page with some random tab. That's a problem too. So make sure you have a tab workflow that makes sense. And again, this is just, by default, your browser does this, but as developers, we have the power to mess that up pretty easily. The next thing that kind of goes with tab flow is focus indicators. So what this just means is that every interactive element on a web page, it's got various effects that you can toggle. So a hover effect is a pretty common one. If I hover over a link, it's very common to have some sort of action. All of these interactive things have some sort of actions. Well, you can also have a focus effect as well, and that's when I'm tabbing on something. If I'm focused on that element, I don't have to be hovering it. I can just be toggling on it with tab, and that's what I'm doing here. If I'm hitting tab, that's the focus effect right there. And by default, my default thing to do with focus elements is I redo the hover effect. Like I just duplicate it. There's usually one other thing I'll do, and it's this kind of outline. So if I let me go back to the menu up here, you can see that I've got this kind of orange outline there. You only see that when you're focused, but it just makes it that much more clear that you are on this element itself. And you can also see that this link is green by default. That's the hover effect right there. It's the same thing. Very good question. Is this something that you handle through CSS? And it is entirely CSS. Absolutely. Yes, everything here that we're going to be talking about is going to be. We really haven't talked about anything JavaScript related. All of this is just HTML. Most of this is going to be CSS related. The only thing JavaScript that I think you need to know at all is just that if I am hovering over this link and I wanted to set an ARIA role or some sort of ARIA property on this, I have to use JavaScript for that. I can't. That's outside of CSS. But everything else, suffice it to say, you can get by pretty much everything in accessibility with just HTML and CSS. So very good question. So this is a focus indicator. It's just very important to know where you're at all point in time if you're using keyboard navigation. Now, so far we've only talked about the tab key, and that is, Shift tab is the go back. So tab and Shift tab. There's other keys that are important too, and one of them is for submit actions. Let's say that you are on a form and you want to submit that form. Well, we kind of know by default you can click on it, but you can ideally also hit enter. So hit enter. Enter is kind of a default form submission thing. Spacebar is also a good form submission key. It's a little bit different because if you're in a text field and you hit enter, it's going to submit the form ideally. If you hit spacebar, it's not going to submit the form. But if you were focused on the button itself and you hit spacebar, that's kind of a standard to go ahead and submit the form. So just think about this, for example. It's a nice blurry image here. But you're entering in this form, and without even hitting this, what we can assume to be a save button down here, we just hit enter, and it does the thing. It submits it. So that's just something that developers need to handle by default. So we've kind of talked about tab key, shift tab, and enter. Well, there's another key as well that's important. This is the last one, and it's for a cancel action, and you maybe assume what this one is. It's the escape key, which does, again, I'm going to use the same example again. If I'm typing in here and I hit escape, it's going to have just the get me out of here without saving any data action. So that could be this cancel button right here. That's probably the same thing. Ideally, this modal would have had an X button on it as well, again, just to keep things standardized. But X button, cancel, or the escape key ideally should all do the same things. And that's important, again, for users who just can't use the mouse very well. Yes, keyboard shortcuts are pretty handy as well, too. And just, yeah, that's a good point. For users with no motor disabilities at all, you might just be a speed user of a web page. You might just want to tab through, and you might have that workflow down. So it is not my responsibility to prevent you from doing that. You should go for it. Okay, we talked about the escape key. Okay, now on the final option here before a bonus, cognitive concerns, and I think that this is one where it affects most of us, and we're gonna get to that last item in a second. You need good content, and none of this really applies to users with quote disabilities. This is something that will apply to everybody, and it's mostly the kind of goal here is don't confuse people. Don't try to, and that has to do with content. That has to do with the UI of the UX of your web page. In this thing at the bottom, I'm really excited to talk about this panic mode. We're going to get to that, but let's start off with good content. So good content is king. Don't have confusing content. Don't have content awkwardly positioned on your website. Make it just a nice, easy flow. If I came to this website to learn something based on the title of that web page, make sure that I learn that thing there, or at least give a reasonable expectation that I'm going to do that. That doesn't mean it has to be simple content. If I go to a PhD's dissertation, I'm not going to I'm going to understand that, but it also should not be written in a complex, manipulative manner or anything. So good content is just something we can all do. And you can do that also by having good labels on buttons, labels for form fields, labels on everything that you need, figures, good titles and headings, clear calls to actions. If you want your user to do something, again, without being manipulative, if it's just a good course of action for their next step, make that clear to them. The next thing, well thought out workflows. This is where my UX designers here. This is where I need you. You gotta basically build the scaffold for me to fill it in with all my codes. So well thought out workflows. You can analyze multiple users' perspective. That helps a significant amount. Building wireframes and giving them to me, that helps a significant amount. Basically, if I don't have to think about anything, that makes it really easy for me. So do that. But having well-defined workflows, again, that's just going to prevent your user from getting confused, because if I build a website with none of that, it's going to confuse everybody, and even myself. I promise that. And the last thing is panic mode. And what I mean by this is, if you were to go to my website or Clever's website or several other websites, you're going to be in a completely different mindset than if you're going to a website like a hospital or a school or a local news site. I doubt people are going to oumedicine.com and just thinking like, I wonder what good doctors are out there today. They're probably thinking, I need to get, my wife just ate some peanut butter. We got the EpiPen going, but I need to get her to the hospital. My wife does have a peanut allergy. I need to get the ER number right away to try to get a reservation, something like that. I'm going to not be thinking about navigating this beautiful link, this beautiful navigation that they have on their website, et cetera. I'm going to need something right in front of me that says, call this number. Ideally not call 911. I think that's kind of a scapegoat. It's very important, but something a little bit more than that. So I kind of mentioned hospitals, schools, if you've got school closings, if there's an intruder alert. I know parents, we're all going to be just hovering over the school's websites, and we want immediate information that's going to be clear to us what's going on. Local news and weather, I know we've all experienced that these last 2 weeks with all the severe weather. So again, just a different mindset that you're going to these websites with, and that's something that you can easily account for. And it's easy because you just have to make things easy. Like pick a few things, usually an alert, and that's it, or some one call to action that your user is most likely there for, and just let them know this is it, front and center. This is why you're here. I'm giving you the information. You can relax a little bit now. So, and again, this is something that we're all going to do at some point in life, is go to a website in panic mode. We all already have at some point, I'm sure of that. So that concludes the cognitive portion of this. I keep being a little tongue-in-cheek about this bonus disability. That's because it's not a real disability. I'm calling it data disability. Not every user has access to just an unlimited amount of data or even a significant amount of data let alone a fast connection. And this applies especially to users in foreign countries. Not every foreign country, absolutely not, but a lot of them, data is just a huge concern. So we have a big benefit here where a lot of our phone plans are either cheap enough to where we don't have to worry about that, or they're just we don't have a super low option. Like medium is kind of our lowest option. So we don't have to worry about this as much. And we've got Wi-Fi a significant amount of places too. But what can you do about this? And this is something that I'm pretty passionate about, just optimizing your web page in general. So you can optimize your images. I love it when when my designers send me these beautiful images and like 5 megabyte images, and they say just put it as a thumbnail on the website. I'm being very tongue-in-cheek because I think most designers are not like that, but it has happened. So optimize your images, get them at the right size before you put them on the web page. Compress them, lossy as well if you have to. Like I think there's a good deal of compression you can do without sacrificing much quality. So my kind of go-to thing on this is that, and this is kind of a good meme about this, the entire Super Mario Brothers original 1985 game was 31 kilobytes. This image is 410 kilobytes. It kind of puts everything into perspective. Again, we're 24 years into the future now from then, but we're probably more than that. Yeah, we're like 34. That's what I meant. But still, these things matter. Okay, so this is kind of my limit I like to do, and it might seem pretty harsh if you've never really thought about image optimization before. 150 kilobytes to 200 kilobytes, that's usually the highest that I ever want to put an image on a web page, and that also includes like the big images, because usually if you give me a giant 3,000 by 4,000 image, I'm going to shrink that down to 1,000 by whatever image, because it just doesn't need to be a 2 megabyte image as a background image. It just doesn't. So this is my standard. I'm not saying you abide by this, and it kind of depends. If your web page is only one image, as a background, you get a little bit more room to mess around with. But images are probably the biggest thing that can just waste bandwidth on people's devices. It's a huge concern. So please optimize your images and minify your CSS and JavaScript. This is on me as a developer, but it would be awesome if I have a designer come to me and say, hey, make sure you minify that, because then it's an extra thing of accountability. Because I could just kind of sweep it under the rug and say, that's not a concern. But when you start talking about it, then I got to worry, oh no, he's gonna tell my boss that I'm not doing this. So, and minification, if you're not familiar, that just means shrinking it down to, all the logic is still there. You're not, unlike an image where you can lossy compress it, where you lose quality, you don't lose any quality by minifying CSS and JavaScript. You just can't read it very well, but that's fine because you don't need to read it when it's on a production web page. I'm not going to develop with the minified version. I just put that on the production website. Yes, that's exactly it. So the question was, is it kind of like where you have all of your CSS property as like font size, but minification would kind of shrink that to be on one line. It would do that, and minification also very often will change your class names to where if you have a class name that's very long class name would be the name, it might just change it to ABC or something, and because that's just less text that your file has to deal with, and it'll update your HTML as well. Again, that's not how every minification practice works, but that's an idea of how it works. It doesn't change the content at all. It just changes things that can be changed that you don't have to care about. So it's very important. You can save a lot of data there. Images are going to be the top thing, absolutely. Don't overdo it on custom fonts. I know my designers love to throw 6 fonts on a web page and tell me to use each one in a certain way. And my argument is I will be okay with 2. That's kind of my personal limit. I'm okay if there's a header font and like a text font. Ideally, it's just one. I'm not going to lie. It'd be cool if there's just one font for everything on a website, just because they take up data that, especially if in a browser, let's say you want to use some cool Google font or something from Adobe Typekit. My browser doesn't have that, so I have to download it on a page load. And browsers do cache. We're going to get to that next, but that's still a lot of data, because we. So it does having different font weights affect things. Is it lighter? And it does affect things in the exact same way. Each font weight has to be its own kind of separate thing. So that's a good point. If you have 6 fonts, but you only have 1 weight for each one, like let's say you just have the standard weight, that's the same as having 1 font but 6 weights, more or less. So that's kind of why when I'm on a web page, I will always ask the designer. If I'm building a website, I'll ask the designer what different text styles are we handling. Usually italics is one. bold, bold italics. Maybe there's the super bold ones. I like to shrink those as much as I can, just because those do take up weight. And each font weight's probably about 30 kilobytes or so. That's give or take, which probably doesn't sound like a lot. But again, if you've got 6 of that, that's an extra 180 kilobytes that you're putting on a web page. It adds up. It really does. So just don't overdo it on it. So set caching HTTP header. This is on the developer. This is on me. By default, a lot of servers will set caching headers properly. It is also in my power to disable that if I want to. Don't let me do that. So that's, by default, the way caching works is if I send you an image on your phone or your device, if you view a web page, your browser will cache that. It will store it there so you don't have to make that request again. The reason developers might change that is because if I change out the image or something, but let's say I keep the same name of it, then your browser's not going to know to fetch the new one. So as a developer, it's easier if nothing gets cached, because then I know your browser's always going to get updated, but that's not a good reason. That's a terrible reason to disable caching. So don't let me do that. And I think that is going to conclude everything here. I told you we were going to get out on time. So want to learn more? I've got a lot of reference links at the end over everything we talked about here, but honestly, we've talked about a lot of stuff here. Like I think I just hammered your brains with a ton of stuff. And if 10% of it stuck, then I'm happy. But to make the rest of it stick, we're streaming this thing. I genuinely think it would be a good idea to watch this thing like 1 or 2 more times. And then from there, you can follow the references that I'm about to show. And then you can just Google things that you want to learn more about. Let's say you want to learn more about how ARIA roles work. This will be a good, once you watch it once or so, it gives you an idea of what that concept is, and then you know enough to Google it yourself. So we usually put these up, I want to say, within a week or so. That said, I've got a lot of references here, very small text here, but this is everything that I referenced here in my browser. So I'll post these slides up somewhere. Again, they're pretty terrible slides, but they are up on my GitHub. You will probably have to go to my GitHub to get these things. I'm sorry, I'm a developer. But that is all that I've got, so thank you very much. I work for Clever. If you want to know more about us and this fancy logo we have here, you can go to clever.com. That's me. I'm the code boss, and my website, you saw a handful of that today, is just thecodeboss.dev. And that is all that I have. So any questions about anything? Yes? So the question is, if you are a designer who doesn't have your dev team, can you use more or less third-party tools like page builders to handle that for you? Or there's some that are better than others and take that into the build process. I see what you mean. Are there some that are better than others? I don't have a list of necessarily the best tools to use, but the answer is yes, and there are a significant amount of tools that will handle that. So for example, WordPress by default does do a very good job of that. It lacks a lot of things as well. But I think the short answer I'm going to get is you're going to get, with a lot of tools, you're probably going to get a maximum of 75 to 80% there. I would probably say 80%. And like you're going to get screen reader usage pretty easily. That's usually things care about that. Or at the very least, a tool like WordPress gives you the capability, and this goes with a lot of CMSs as well, and page builders. It gives you the capability to put in like your alt text and your title tags and all that. It's up to you to put that in there. But the capabilities are there. But things like tab flows are going to be a little bit hit or miss. You're going to have less control over that. So the big ones, I would say, again, screen reader and more visual concerns, tooling will support that pretty easily right out of the box. And it really does depend on how popular the tool is. The more popular tools are going to have a significant amount of that built out. But you won't get all the way there. But again, using a tool like that, you're not falling behind. If anything, you're right on par or a little bit above what most other websites are doing. Most websites are not focusing on this unless they're government websites, and I think that's just a terrible excuse. But very good question. I think I roundabout answered that. Yes?
Do you have, or in the future, would you want to create a cheat sheet for designers to ask the developers, like a skip menu?
Ooh. So the question is, do I want to add do I want to add a cheat sheet to put myself in a hole when a designer comes up to me and says, did I do all this stuff? The real answer is yes, we can do that. The other answer I want to give is I'm not sure when I'll get that out there. It's just impossible to do. Yes, that's possible. No promises on when that's coming, but it's possible. All right, anything else? Yes. there are, I think these are the ones that I mostly use are max. So you kind of get into two ideas of compression. With compression, so I kind of mentioned we've got that building CSS or minifying CSS and JavaScript process. That's usually an automated process when development happens. You can also throw in image optimization in that process, and there are tools that will handle JPEGs, PNGs, SVGs, and they all have their own names. But as far as something that a designer, for example, would use, you can use whatever tool you want to just crop it, for example. And Photoshop, you've got your save for web features and all that. But I have a tool, and I've got it here. I've got two. And I think these are Mac specific, which is why I'm not trying to promote them a ton. But Image Optim is great. It's incredibly easy to use, and it is not a lossy compression tool. You just dump in an image there. You put it in there, and it just automatically compresses it. It compresses it on the fly, and it just saves it right there. So you literally dump the image in here, and it's bam, done very quickly. Another tool called Image Alpha that I use as well. This is specific to PNGs, but it compresses the heck out of them like crazy. Like you can take a 400 kilobyte PNG and take it to like a 40 kilobyte PNG with and this is a lossy compression tool. This one, Image Alpha, only works for PNGs, but it's not, I don't know, you can control all of that. You can control how much loss you want, but it is just incredible, and I've never run into a quality concern on this. So in addition to just kind of, you got Photoshop as a big one. I think that's one a lot of people here are going to know about. Just you can crop and save things out that way. You've got your automated optimization tools for developers, but on a Mac, I use Image Optim and Image Alpha, and they're free. They're easy to download. And Image Optim is for any image at all. Image Alpha is only for PNGs, but it is just killer with PNGs. So very good question. All right, well, thank you very much, everyone. Well, thank you, everybody. That's me.